name is Michael Albib, and I'm here, I think, as a representative of the community that's trying to bridge between architecture and neuroscience to introduce our speaker today, Bob Condia. Bob has been a strong supporter of the Academy of Neuroscience for Architecture. I met him at the 2014 conference. He was part of the introductory panel at the 2016 conference. Perhaps most amazingly, he is an architect who has set up a successful partnership with a genuine neuroscientist. He's working with Colin Ehlert, who some of you saw talk here a few months ago, and they're looking at the architecture and neuroscience of urban space. So you'll hear a little bit about that later in the talk. I just want to say a few words about Bob's history. He is that rare creature, a native of San Diego. He went on to study architecture at San Luis Obispo, had a later stint at Columbia, but he was practicing here in San Diego for a number of years and even had a stint about 30 years ago lecturing here at the NewSchool. But for many years now, he has been at Kansas State University and in fact is in town shepherding a group of 12 studio students from the School of Architecture there to give them the wonders of architecture in San Diego. And with that, I introduce Bob Condia.
Well, if it all goes well, then the technology will be on my side. So we're in seminar today, and thank you for having me here today, and for the introduction from my friend Michael. Michael and I have been trying to figure out how architects and scientists can talk to one another. See if I can talk to you a little bit about science today. So be a little bit different. What's at stake with neuroscience and architecture? So I think my position in this discussion is as an architect who can apply something of the neuroscience. But you have to know something about the neuroscience. You have to get your hands a little bit dirty and messy in it. I think the implications are quite profound for architects and neuroscience, because we're talking about perception when we're talking about the brain. If this will work.
Do you like it? I cannot hear them. But I know they are making a hash of it. What do you think? Music is a dreadful thing. What is it? I don't understand it. What does it do?
It exalts the soul.
Utter nonsense. If you hear a marching band, is your soul exalted? No, you march. If you hear a waltz, you dance. If you hear a mass, you take communion.
It is the power of music to carry one directly into the mental state of the composer. The listener has no choice. It is like hypnotism.
So now,
He goes on to talk about, he says, what was in my mind when I was doing this? And he says, it's a man trying to get to his lover, but he can't get there. He's stuck in the mud, and this is the sound of his agitation. Architecture, as we know it, is a nonverbal communication that echoes deep, right? This is what architects understand. What is it like? Like this. If you hear a marching band, you march. You hear a mass, you take communion. What we'll talk about in a little bit is the notion of affordances, which I think is very much this same idea. For me, when I left NewSchool back in 1987 and started teaching architecture, they told me, even when I was here, in fact, that you can't teach creativity. So I was in trouble because that's what I was going to do for a profession. You can't teach anyone architecture, but they can learn it. How can they learn it? And so creativity, I find this guy, Arthur Koestler, And he wrote a book called The Act of Creation. And this comes out of the science of the 50s for the most part. And what he does is he says creativity has three personalities: the jester, the sage, and the artist. Each one of these is attached to an involuntary human response: laughter, revelation, weeping. Involuntary, nothing you can do about it. So what I was interested in is architecture is very much, again, like this. How is architecture like this? And the psychology of the 50s gave me insight into the game. What's important, and the point I want to leave you with here, is that from Arthur Koestler, since he's doing an applied book as well, right? How is creativity useful to a novelist, to a writer? What did he learn from examining the science? You find out that the most important thing is recreation, right? Creativity exists insofar as it's recreated. See if we can make this work.
Next week, I'm going to have an MRI to find out whether or not I have claustrophobia. In school, they told me practice makes perfect, and they told me nobody's perfect, so then I stopped practicing. Here's some of my answers to some everyday questions.
All right, so did you guys catch that? Right, practice makes perfect. They tell me in school, practice makes perfect. Then they tell me no one's perfect, so I give up. What's happening here, right? So first of all, I have to get you on board with the game. Practice makes perfect. You guys all heard that, right? Practice makes perfect. And then you also remember being in school and they say, well, nobody's perfect. And he just puts the two things together, which seems to surprise you. So this observation that he makes snaps. And so what Koestler suggests is that emotion has inertia. Practice makes perfect. You're on board. You're coming along with him. Nobody's perfect. So I stopped practicing. So he argues that emotion has inertia, and it's the intellect which snaps that, okay? I'm going to get an fMRI tomorrow just to see if I'm claustrophobic. The unexpected. If I'm going to tell you about fMRIs in terms of neuroscience, how we use the brain, it captures the brain flow, hopefully some of this stuff will come to you, and you'll see that that guy knows something about neuroscience and architecture, and you'll leave refreshed and changed because there's the revelation. You've learned something. Can't go back. You're changed. Aesthetic. Or I'm going to get an fMRI tomorrow because my lungs don't work right, and they're going to try to find out what's going on, and in the end, I'm going to die from something. Maybe you weep along, right? But there's an attachment between the creative act and the recreative act that he calls aesthetic experience, which is this connection that we have, which we'll later talk about as empathy. But let's just say aesthetic experience is always a combination of this thinking and feeling. Thinking and feeling. Thinking elevates your sense of something, your connection to something, your awareness of something, but it's always rebased in an emotional understanding. Sorry, honey, I know we've been dating for 8 years, but I found someone else. Came as your little Twitter feed. How do you feel? Well, it's just a Twitter feed. How could it be anything, right? Came on a Dear John. So you can see if there's an investment of some renown, some experience, that the profundity of that short note from your lover could be quite something. Aesthetic experience, crudely defined. Although my friend Harry Mulgrave is well known for this Einfühlung, right, feeling into, which comes from a much older understanding from the 1900s, where the Germans say, look, there's something about things and people that we can feel into them. Isn't it strange that we could feel into something? So Einfühlung is a German term, which is pretty good, of feeling into. First seen for me at this, in Kosa's book, English doesn't have a really good term for this, so we call it empathy. It's not quite the same thing. So let's modify this a little bit. Let's call it the architect's empathy, because what architects are interested in is how do we feel into things. This is strange, right? Easy to understand how we empathize with someone else. He's just lost his girlfriend to a better looking dude. She just lost her baby, right? And we can feel into this. Or we can be up on screen with Dumbo when he loses his mother, and we're crying right with him. You guys heard of Dumbo, right? I have to work on my movie references here. So there's a magic where we're both here and there simultaneously. What can we call it? Let's call it empathy, but in terms of architecture, it's called architect's empathy. But understand it's feeling into something. All right, the other lesson I need to leave with you with is that when I was growing up long ago, we were told that you only use 10% of your brain. That's wrong, by the way. You use 100% of your brain 100% of the time, and most of what it's doing is filtering out too much information. Most of what it's doing is filtering. Psychologists call this attention. Right? So you can only attend to a certain amount of the information that's coming into it. This will be more important in a minute. But there is no little source in the top of your head someplace where the true you is operating levers. If we had more time, we could spend some time talking about where consciousness resides. It is out there. It's not in here, it's out there. You fill consciousness to the limits of your perception. So, do you know what's behind you there? Do you have an idea where that wall is? Yeah, you know where that wall is, right? How do you know that? You can't see it. How do you know that wall is there? How do you know how this room is mapped out? How do you know this, but yet you know? How do you know that? We're going to talk about vision in a minute, but the optics of vision are not seeing, right? So seeing is different. So your body, your sensory organism, is a mobile nervous system. And this is the thing that architects need to understand, right? That you are a mobile nervous system, and all your perception, all your sensory activity is at stake. And we hear this with our phenomenological colleagues like our friend Johanni Palaasmaa and Harry Mulgrave and others. So anyway, this is what this is trying to show, that this is from the Naples Museum. Anybody been to the Naples Museum? If you get a chance to go see the Naples Museum, it will blow your mind, folks, because, can I say that? It's California, I can say you blow your mind. All right. So this statue is more than 3,000 years old, and he's looking right at you. So the Greeks understood the body and relationship of the bodies between people. And we see it in the architecture, but we see it particularly well here. I don't want to spend too much time because Harry's books are much better. In fact, the new book on culture, which is coming out, I think, in the summer, it's very good. So Harry's been the leader in this discussion about neuroscience for architects. And we're looking here to break down the barrier, certainly from my lifetime as an architect, where theory, whatever that quite meant, was in charge. But the body really had lost its place. I'm a Cal Poly grad. And Cal Poly grads knew that architecture and psychology were teamed up. We knew this. And then there's a lot of theories about post-structuralism. Not fun stuff to read, by the way. But it wasn't very fruitful for architects, and it actually separates, along with the technology, the imaging and the systems away from humans and the body. The attempt now is to bring this back. Let's see if we can't move away from a Cartesian sense of architecture and a more biological sense of architecture, meaning the human animal is something which is at stake, which frankly is what we learned in the 70s. We just didn't follow up on it. But Harry's books, you guys know these books? I mean, this is the good stuff. So in simplest terms, the empathy is this interpersonal, nonverbal communication. Nonverbal communication. I mean, we seem to know quite a bit about people, right? Honey, everything's okay. And you know immediately you messed up and everything is not okay. You heard it, but you don't see it. How do you know this? And we're trained on this kind of nuance of empathetic relationship deep into our childhood. Very fast. In fact, there's an interesting paper about scientists was testing some 15-month-old babies. They would ask them for candy or salad, and the baby would give you whichever one you asked for. At 18 months, you ask the baby for a candy or salad, the baby will give you candy because no one wants salad, right? And at 18 months, this is going on. I don't want to spend too much time with mirror mechanisms because Dr. Arbib's here and I'm terrified, but you need to know that someone has figured out that there's a system in your brain of about 20% of your motor control neurons that are there to observe others. They don't make your body operate. That's a different set of things in your brain, but associated with these are neurons in your brain that help you observe. In a lab in Parma, you guys heard this mythological story? All right, so they have some monkeys wired up. They're eating peanuts, their brains are lighting up. Researcher comes in, monkey doesn't have a peanut, and his brain lights up. Why is that? Well, they had anticipated some of this. Rizzolatti, I think they actually knew what was going on ahead of this. But this is why we can imitate so well, right? My son, today I'm going to give you a written dissertation on how to skin a deer. Or you can just watch for 5 minutes, pay attention, right? Why is that? How is it that we are so easily communicating with the body language, one to the other, through this empathetic system? It's these mirror mechanisms. There's something foundational about this mirror system that you need to be paying attention to because it should change the way architects see the world, right? It should give you a basis on which you can speak to other people from a point of knowledge because you know better the biological creature for which you're designing for. Make sense? Right? I'm trying to give you some power. My job today is to help you become a better architect by understanding how to apply the neuroscience, or at least flip a switch in you to say, well, there's something there that I can use. So for me, the motor mechanisms in the nervous system manifest as embodied simulation as the organic source of empathy. Right? So I'm tracing it back then to the Kosa's argument about aesthetic experience. Embodied simulation is aesthetic experience par excellence. I mean, this is it, right? When you participate with the other, you're in the game, right? It's aesthetic. You're involved in that art. Follow me? Just checking the eyes. You see nuance, right? This guy's paying attention. I got him all right. Not too much science, little science. This is quite a famous paper. You might read this one in your seminar. But David Freiberg and Vittorio Galese. Now, Vittorio is from Parma, one of the guys who's in the lab with Rizzolatti. Vittorio is very aggressively seeking relationship between mirror neurons and the outside world. He's drifted into a phenomenological critique. Dr. Freiberg is at Columbia. He's a art historian. In their experiments, they said, well, we're looking at two kinds of things. One is the actual kind of pigments making a story for you, right? The story of St. Thomas saying, yeah, let me see that cut. You guys feel that? Your little sensation that he's sticking his finger in the side of Jesus? And the other was they said, well, in abstract ways, these sliced canvases of Fontana are similar, that people respond to these and we get some data about how they respond. But the conclusion would come from this is that unlike the last 50 years of art history, they say, you know, art history, you got it wrong. Because art history says there's nothing but cognition in aesthetic experience. And they say, no, no, no. If you sense or simulate these cuts on the canvas, then you're in an embodied simulation, or what they call embodied simulation theory. You have embodied it. Your sensation, your understanding of this as one of action. I did that. Or the painting, finger in the wound. You simulate that, you sense that. And so they said, no, no, art history, you've got it wrong. At least some portion of your aesthetic experience is biological through mirror neurons, through embodied simulation. It's not just cognitive. And we'll talk a little bit more about what I think the separation of that is. Whether or not this feeds directly into architecture, well, we're debating this, okay? I mean, I'm not giving you too many facts here today, well, maybe a few. I might even tell you with a little more authority than I actually believe. However, I want you to begin to understand there's something at stake here. You need to get involved. You need to pay attention to this, right? Let me just do this. Are you, as a group, do you think about sustainability? Is that a good thing? Okay. How many of you guys think about it? Right? How many of you read the science on sustainability? Yeah, but you believe it all the same. Okay. This stuff is the next round. This is your round, right? So sustainability, we kind of got that under control. The human actor in architecture will be the thing you need to be paying attention to. And this is the beginning for this. The thing about mirror neurons, as we understand them, is that you understand, say, the sound of a hammer, and in body simulation says, well, then you have a sensation, a gentle one, in the same place as if you were holding the hammer, move through your body. fMRIs would see some color lighting up, and the scientists would make correlation between that blood flow and say, well, you seem to be thinking about, you seem to be representing. Does your arm twitch? Not especially. Apparently my mother's leg used to twitch when I missed a shot in basketball. I'm not sure how that worked. Maybe it's biological there. So the mirror system has these numbers of scales. You're participating in something outside of your body through this biological system, but you have a sensory system as well that knows whether it's you or not that's doing something. Another very famous bit, kind of the Villa Savoy, so to speak, of embodied simulation theory. So on the left, it's hard to see. So we have a hand touching a chair, a palm touching the arm, a hand touching a hand, and a palm touching the chair. What they discovered, more or less can prove, it's published, it's peer reviewed, give the science some credit, that in all these cases, a similar part of the brain is involved, right? fMRI, blood flow, predicts brain activity, that's the correlation. And the degree is different, right? Very light degree of correlation here, high degree of correlation here, right? So the more human is, the greater the effect. And yet, even here, two things touching. And Harry Mulgrave likes to talk about the importance of two things touching is there anything in architecture that doesn't come down to that? Two materials, to something coming together. And this idea actually of materials touching one another would be very good research for you to get your hands on and do, actually. All right, so as we've moved through, what I appreciated about Gillespie, in part, was that when he comes to his conclusion about what is aesthetic experience, an aesthetic experience is one that allows us, the beholder, to perceive, feel, sense an artwork, which implies the activation of sensoromotor, emotional, and cognitive mechanisms. Right? So, again, aesthetic experience is simulation, embodied simulation. So, embodied simulation theory, write that one down. That's something that you want to follow up on. Okay, but this is completely in line with Koestler's understanding of what aesthetic experience is. So for me, that kind of double pressure on the definition gives me a high level of satisfaction that we're on to something. So neuroscience by way of mirror mechanisms gives us an embodied simulation, which is the mechanism for making the recreative act in some measure biological. I've offered this to the American Institute of Architects. They seem a little resistant. I think it'd be tremendously profound for our profession to recognize and to leverage an understanding that aesthetic experience isn't some lightweight kind of thinking, but an actual fact of biology, at least in some measure. Aesthetic experience is biological, at least in some measure. Right? How much? And this is really a divergence in a way with scientific thinking, right? Because scientific thinking, scientific method, how many times can you be wrong in a scientific theory? How many times can you be wrong? Just once, right? It's done. Once you prove it wrong, it's wrong, it's done. In an architectural theorem, if such thing really exists, if we're 10, 15, 20% correct, and we're moving along based on professional expertise, we're probably in a pretty good place. Very different ways of thinking about the actual fact of architecting is one thing. Theoretical constructs that float on top of that. Hard to say how much of that is at play in an architectural project. But if we could move the biology, from biology, move our plane up to a greater level of mastery, a greater level of authority, as we do with structures, as we do with expansion and contraction, as we do with plumbing, as we do with roofing, as we do with any number of other things in architecture which are scientifically based, although we handed all those to engineers. I think if we can say that aesthetic experience is fundamentally grounded in the biological creature through an embodied simulation theory, whatever we mean by that, we're getting someplace, right? We're at a higher plane from which to spring and talk about the intuition that is expertise. This is I think it's called the Well of Souls, the Penumbra. This is 5,000 years old, built before the, what do they call those things in Egypt? Pyramids, yeah, the pyramids. So this preceded that. But I know exactly what you're thinking. How'd they get that big rock up there? Nonverbal communication. What's going on here, right? So at the perimeter, or one archaeologist named Richards suggested at the perimeter of boundaries of tribal orders would be things like this. Because what does this tell you? It tells you about a level of cooperation among people and magic and so many other things that when you hit one of these, if you're crossing the land, you'd go, holy mackerel, we better watch out for those guys, all right? There's a whole bunch of other stuff I like about this. In part, the level of craft in things, which seems to pass by. And if you look at these ancient stones, then those Neolithic architect colleagues of ours, before the Greeks, you'll find that their level of craftsmanship is really something else. Well, speaking of craftsmanship, you guys recognize this one? You guys been down there to see it? Good man. It's a pretty good building. Architects like this building. Why do they like this building? Yeah, why do architects like that building? Okay. Is that an arched space? All right, let's do a little architect in here for a minute. In the original sketches that you can find at the Kahn Institute, among other places, right? One of the original sketches has this kind of faceted ceiling with a slice down the middle. There's a woman looking at a small painting because he was directed by Richard Brown, who's the director at the time, to take the collection, which is largely small pieces, and make them domestic for the Texas climate, like a house. And so at the side of this drawing, you see with silver light from above. The rest of the work then was from that experience, because as you know as architects, right, the experience is always demonstrated in the sectional design. Right? If I need to make the program present to myself, it's in the section. Silver light from above. So they spent the rest of their time trying to figure out how to get that silver light. Well, it's also really a Roman building, isn't it? Isn't it an ancient kind of Roman vault? You guys been to the Trajan's Forum in Rome? It's a good place. It has vaults like this in form. Well, not quite like this, but you see it as a vaulted space. You're fooled into believing it's a vaulted space. What's wrong with the vault? Yeah, there's a hole in the middle. Can't have a hole in the middle of a vault, it falls down. But we sense vaultness, right? What we know as architects is that it's really this, right? It's really a butterfly system, right? 200-foot beams in the shape of this butterfly. So you can cut the middle out. And this is the first lighting, right? Lighting device, which wasn't about light, which was about natural light. And so this mix of technology, right? So it's once ancient reference, Roman space. And if you look at Kahn, he's always got those drawings out in front of him of ancient ruins. Salk is a ruin if you take a look at the top, right? I mean, if you look at the fragment, it's just a ruin sitting there with a great view of the ocean. And we get the silver light from above. How does architecture do what architecture does? This image looked a little better in practice. Architecture exchanges on emotion, changes on emotion. Nonverbal communication changes on emotion. There's a difference between feelings and emotion. You know what the difference is? All right, how about this? Step out on the curb, and the taxi's coming fast. Stepping off the curb, the taxi's coming fast. I'm going to examine my feelings now. Or do you just get out of the way? Emotions are very fast, and they can be measured. Feelings are the reflection after the fact. So for architects, and we steal this from, again, from Malgrave, if a biological definition is the response of an organism to a stimulus, say a taxi or a tiger, an architectural definition would be a response of an organism to a built environment. Could we argue, in fact, that you're dealing with your environments at all times? I was thinking on the flight out where I don't know about you, but I'm big enough that sitting in those little seats in airplanes is not my favorite thing to do. But they love to come on and say, what a lovely thing that they've done in terms of their service. No, we've just simply endured the experience. We've endured. And so how much of architecture that we subject people to is really this endurance test? Shitty office building? Endure it. It's your job. Endure that. Wouldn't it be interesting if architects could take the lead once again and say, you know, we know the difference between bad buildings and good buildings, which we do, but you have to prove it. And this is the rough thing. Right? When I began to look at neuroscience and other science, I walked across the campus to the place where they do grants and things. And I learned two things. First of all, what can an architect say about science? Number two, you might know that, but you have no data. So I thought, all right, so we get data by talking about the things we already know. Answer, yes, but you don't have data. That's a significant deal. And what do architects have to say about science? Well, we can apply the science. So what do emotions mean in architecture? Emotion is pre-reflective biological process integrated with the immediate embodied, right? Feelings come later. Our friend Juhani Plasma calls this, well, let me rephrase this, let me put it differently. Peter Zumthor talks about it as a first impression. First impression. How long does it take to read a space? I can tell you, having looked at vision now, that somewhere less than 200 milliseconds, you can read a space. 200 milliseconds, fifth of a second, you got an idea of what the space is. You may not recognize all the nuances there, but you've already seen the color. A flash. At some students, we've looked at what we mean by first impression, and it's not a lightweight thing, actually. First impression is actually a substantial understanding of something. I don't want to go out with that person. I don't like that person's dangerous. You may be wrong. That's a possibility, you could miss that. But it's not lightweight thinking. It's a substantial expose of your experience. Emotion architecture is always an embodied multi-sensory experience, okay? We had a guy, and I felt sorry for him in the back of the room when we were talking at ANFA in 16. He said, but we all know architecture is an optical. Buddy, haven't you heard anything we've said to you? Architecture is a full body, full contact sport. Everything. And you know this, right? You know how to think about, I'm doing architecture and it smells, it tastes, it touch. Plasma's 7 senses are pretty good, right? The 5 senses that we normally know plus gravity, and our visual sense that we can somehow read the tactile nature of things out there. How is that possible? Well, empathy, embodied simulation, but this is the things that architects deal with. At least those 7 senses. If you want a simple critique to improve your work, just lay that out. I'm looking at my work, it's sitting on my desk. All right, let's do my Plasma 7 senses critique. That'll improve the work, guaranteed, because now the full body is immersed. All sensory perception is emotional. In architecture, not just churches and cemeteries, emotion is integrated into the process of perception. You cannot perceive without emotion being part of the game, right? The Cartesian world in which we seem to have inherited is coming apart. You guys know about Cartesian world? Only the rational side of the brain counts. Only cognitive side of art counts. Only the monetary side of things, only the, right? Only when we can keep a scorecard in some quantifiable way. Just as you, same way you choose mates, right? Isn't that what you say? She doesn't have to be a lovely woman as long as she's rich and can cook well. Is that how that goes? No, it's not. So emotions are always involved in perceptions. And then they're actually the way the brain's structured, that thinking cap that we're so fond of seeing that's all wiggly and stuff, underneath that is an mammalian brain with a high level of emotions that make the body go. The mammalian brain's actually there to kind of keep you from doing stuff with it, right? It's actually the inhibitor. In simplest terms, I'll just give you this kind of axis because this is going to help you think about it. So there's, for lack of a better term, flight responses, right? Rage, fear, panic. How much this is chemical, I haven't quite got this nailed down, but I think there's a sense that there's a bit of adrenaline at stake. Kosa would tell you that comedy is here, right? There's always something at stake in comedy. Someone's always getting picked on in comedy. There's always an aggression or a touch of adrenaline in comedy. If you're making fun of somebody, you're making fun of them, and there's an aggressiveness to it. Flight response. Got to get out of here. Your body was made to move, to get out of the way, to run from the bears, tigers. The hedonic side, the pleasure side, right? These are the axes. Is there a bit of dopamine that kicks in when you see a pretty face? It's the reward side, right? I do know McDonald's puts some pretty good rewarding stuff in their food for you, in case you wondered why you had to eat that stuff. Watch Fast Food Nation, you see all this. It's understood. So there's a little bit of happiness, a little bit of dopamine, you know. Drinking beer, man, a little dopamine makes you feel good. It's happy stuff. We'd like our architecture actually to be a little bit more down here, but this is the axis, right? And again, I'm oversimplifying for you. I'm trying to make this digestible so that you can chase a little bit more of this later. So for me, the art of building and the biology of the brain converge in aesthetic experience as a recreative act. So what do we know? If you want someone to understand your building, by which I mean this nonverbal communication, what do you have to do? You have to get them on board. Is it a vaulted space that we seem to understand archetypally, right? It's a simple vaulted space. You're on board with it. Then he cuts out the ceiling. Then he adds the light. And as architects, we go, how do you make those curving beams do that? That's impossible. Now we're mesmerized by the quality of his craftsmanship and the invention of his structural engineer. All right, here we go. So embodied simulation is the architect's empathy, is the aesthetic experience of real architecture that is tacit as mood. So back when I first started looking at Arthur Koestler, I understood that aesthetic experience meant recreation, right? Creation, creativity means recreation. How can I get you to respond to what I'm doing? That's the game. What is the craft of this connection that you and I are trying to make between one another? How do I get you on board to get the momentum of your emotion to then deal with it aesthetically and craft your response? Well, what does that give us? How is it that we're exchanging this with those people out there? What am I investing to work with? And I came to this term mood. I did this years ago and I felt terrible, right? So I've done all this study, I've done all this figuring out, I know what creativity is, I know how to recreate, and the word mood is where I've got to. Doesn't sound like, you know, simulation, that sounds like something, right? Mood. And yet, our friend in neuroscience is coming, because mood is a psychological condition, and that psychological condition be measured, and it is not a lightweight thing, right? If emotion is immediate and it is very fast, we have devices that I can put on your fingers and measure microswept, and it will read at 2,000 times a second, and it's changing. 2,000 times a second. If you do that, by the way, you overload your Excel files, so don't do that. Mood is measurable and is in fact what I'm trying to give away. What are you trying to give away? You get someone sitting, carve them out a nice window seat, place a nice mat on there for it's soft, maybe a back where you can put your back against while you read. Maybe it's close to a fireplace with a stereo. What are you doing? You're trying to change mood, aren't you? That's what architects do. We navigate through the adjustment of mood in our audience. So medium, the mood is the medium of exchange, right? So this is the other question I was asking, right? If all art has within it a medium of exchange, painting has paint, sculpting has sculpting, music has sound, what is it architecture does? What is it architecture does? What is its exchange mechanism? It's the mood. It's our medium of exchange. So all of this real stuff that you put in place, these doors, these walls, this drywall, this steel beams, lights, all of this real stuff that you put in place, the effect that you're heading for is the exchange of mood. You guys already know that? Am I boring you? I thought it was kind of a big deal at the time. So what you have to be a master of to be a good architect is a master of mood. And you already know something about this because you're thinking about lighting and other stuff, right? Well, we're going to get to atmosphere here. Architecture gives an opportunity, right? No guarantee. Gives an opportunity for an embodied aesthetic experience when encountering an atmosphere where the physiological result is mood. So if mood is what the result we're looking for, the vehicle we're using is atmosphere. Atmosphere. You guys heard that word? You gotta be careful with that word. I'll get to that in a second. Before I get there, I want to talk to you a little bit about central and peripheral vision. There's a difference between central and peripheral vision. So what I need you to do for a moment is stick your arm out in front of you. And your fist at arm's length is about a 5-degree cone. And this is what we would call in science a foveated vision. The back of the eye, I'll show you in a second, is where all the focus stuff is. And it's only about a 5-degree cone, but it smooths out. It's not like there's no clear line on that, but it kind of, but this is pretty close to being foveated or central vision. Now, at K-State, we have a colleague named Les Loschke. Les Loschke is one of the world's preeminent authorities on central and peripheral vision. I had a doctoral student, Kevin Rooney is his name, and Kevin studied with Les. And in the simplest experiment Les has, you can take a computer screen and you have eye tracking, so wherever you look, you have a 5-degree occlusion on the screen. And if you're standing behind the person looking at this screen, you will see that there is all of the text except for this little dot. And you cannot read. 95% of that thing is available for you in text, but you cannot read it. No one can. If I switch that, if I give you that foveated vision in which you can see and ascertain what something is and tell what color it is, and we take you to outside to see a scene, and I give you that, and you trace that around, you have no idea where you're at. Switch it again. We're outside. I occlude a cone of 5 degrees. You have no trouble knowing where you're at. Kevin saw this and he said, you know, that's very interesting. And as an architect, I bet there's a difference in the aesthetic experience of architecture based on this vision change. So that was his dissertation. I steal this from my fine colleague, Colin Ehlert. Sorry, Colin. And this is about what it's like, right? Can you see the focus right here? So this is a representation. It's not really like this, but this is a representation. But it has 2 points here. One is there's not very much that is in focus that everyone thinks is in focus, right? If we talk about vision, you presume it's central vision, which is focus. We all do, right? That's not true, right? So lesson number 2 for the day. You can tell people that you know there's a difference between central and peripheral vision. You can put your arm out in front of you, and if you want to size things in your projects and look at the moment-making potential of spot-on elements, it's right here. The other thing it tells us, this is upside down on the back of your eye, and this is optics. What does this have to do with seeing? Well, it's important, but it's not 100% seeing, right? Seeing has your whole body involved in the thing, which is why you know where that wall is behind you, why you know that stuff is above you. So if we just deal in optics, we're really not being architects. And Colin says it really beautifully. This makes it very clear that perception of the world comes to us as a nice piece of choreography. It's really kind of a lovely way to think about it, right? The world comes through us as choreography, our dance with the world around us. This is really dense. We can use an architectural term here. I've got an architectural audience. This is Kevin Rooney's part T of his dissertation. I'll point out a couple things that are important. So here's central vision, and it's focused attention. How many of you have ever started reading a book or looking at something, watching a film, and then just there, oblivious to what's happening out here? Anybody else? Just me and him? Have any of you ever, I'm updating this, ever been in your car, cruising down the road and working on your texting, and then looked up and went, oh shit. All right. Your brain can only attend to one thing at a time. There's a lot of information coming in, but what psychologists call attention is a very focused portion of that. We're nimble, but it's not instantaneous. You're not multitasking, there's no such thing. You're nimble, you're fast, but you can't do two things at once. Your brain just doesn't do that. Your brain does one thing at a time. You cannot text and drive, by the way. If there's nothing else I tell you, remember that part. And so if you're attending to central vision, you might catch something out here, and then we'll turn to use our central vision to ascertain what it was. Right? So the tools of central vision are very important to us. They give us color, definition. Central vision tells us what something is. Well, quite significantly, and this is really something we've started looking at with much more care, the idea that there's two streams in the brain, right? Two ways of understanding, two ways in which information from the optics come to the brain, to the motor control centers up front. There's the ventral stream, which is coming underneath, and it tells us what something is. There's the dorsal stream, which goes over top, and it tells us where something is. Where is peripheral vision? You need peripheral vision to be able to stand upright, to be balanced, but you just catch gists of scenes out here. But if you're in the field of flowers, is it more important for you to see a flower or to see the field? If you're on the savannah, is it more important for you to see the tree or to scan for the tigers coming to get you? So somehow we've evolved to have this distinction to the point where there's actually two streams in the brain. We're not exactly sure what all this is about just yet. People are looking into this. But understand this, that there's two large mechanisms that are operating, right? There's nothing that's independent in the brain. Everything connects up. In fact, neuroscientists talk about the way things map together. And this is how the brain actually operates. And if we had more time, I'd tell you all kinds of fun factoids, but I'll leave that out. So peripheral vision is everything else. And some of the things that Kevin thinks are quite interesting about this, we're interested out here in action, where he alludes it to what he calls the prosthetic sense of space. How do you know where that rear bumper is on your car? How do you know where that wall is back there? It's as if you've expanded into this, right? You know where that bumper is through experience and also through sitting in the driver's seat. Size of your rooms, size of your bedrooms. Prosthetic, it's really an extension of ourselves, right? We have the same relationship with tools and things that we might use. This stuff out here is pre-conscious. Right? We seem to turn to this. We seem to catch the scene. I was at a football game the other day, and a student of mine I hadn't seen in a long time was standing against the wall checking his cell phone. I walked by him and took 2 steps back and knew exactly who it was. He is a little bigger than he used to be, but nonetheless, is the same guy. So there's a recognition processing. Hi, Joe, how you doing? Okay, so we get this stuff, right? Peripheral vision tells you where you're at, gives you balance, order, the prosthetic of space. Central vision tells you what, gives you color, definition, understanding. For instance, who can say what they're drinking right now? Where are you at? You guys know where you're at? You can say it. It's a coffee shop. You guys ever been to a coffee shop? Yeah, they have coffee there. They also have tea and other stuff. But if you include your central vision, you don't know what's there. Let's reverse it. Well, now you know you're drinking a cup of coffee with some cream in it. Ugh, cream. So these are 2 conditions that we use in experiments, right, to occlude central vision, or a window to occlude peripheral vision. All right, this is going to be a little more difficult because I have to try and be more scientific. So some time ago, I knew Colin Ehlert. He'd made a number of presentations at the Academy for Neuroscience and Architecture. A very nice group of folks, by the way. You should, if you don't know these guys, you should be there. But Harry Mulgrave says, you know, I've been looking at both your stuff and Colin's stuff. I think you ought to call Colin up and you guys ought to do something together. So I called Colin up and we started doing something together. We found out that we actually did have a number of intersections. He was working with central peripheral vision. We're working with central peripheral vision. He's trying to figure out how architecture or urbanism can be studied out in the world, and we want to take our work out into the world. Yeah, I'll put it this way. So I'm in a good place. I'm a senior professor at one of the major architecture schools in America. I'm in a pretty good place. And I started going down the path of some neuroscience, and I would not recommend this for any tenure track faculty because we didn't know where it's going to go. But it's worked out pretty good for me. Because the only way that architects can talk to neuroscientists is we have to learn their language. It's not really coming the other way, except for Dr. Arbu, right? It's not really working the other way. In the 2014 ANFA, Dr. Albright was there. We're talking, and I said, Tom, architects are reading about the neuroscience. What architecture are the neuroscientists reading about? He says, none. He wasn't being cruel or anything. He just says it's not of interest to them. It's not part of their game. So if the game is going to be on, you and I, as architects, we have to do this work. And this is normal for architects anyway. We're really quite good at being generalists. But if we're going to advance this idea of perception, the responsibility we use, and you guys are in exactly the right place, right? Because you got all these tools around you, right? And the people. So I'll leave you with that bit and talk about this experiment that we did. Wait, let me go back one. So this, remember this square, this is the glass square. So we did an experiment, and the experiment was to see if we could get biological response in different conditions. Central vision, peripheral vision, control. Our job was to invent spaces, right? So the architects got together and we said, well, what are the parameters? Well, one parameter is that virtual reality goggles to do this study, you can only be in the space about 1.5 minutes. So it's all right, 1.5 minutes, pedestrian pace about 2 miles an hour, all right, about 500-foot loop, got it. So about a 500-foot loop gave us a 100 by 50-foot space. We did it 100 by 50 because Vitruvius tells us this is the most perfect room, and we're doing 2 urban squares. I've done some other work before where we were trying to get aesthetic experience, and we were trying to show people what we thought were ugly houses and good houses. So we had award-winning houses that we would show people and ugly houses, which we thought were ugly. What we found is that people who didn't know anything about architecture didn't think they were so ugly. And so we didn't get any really good biological response. So if you want biological response, and I'll tell you right now, getting good data is really, really, really hard. It's as hard as designing anything you'd ever want to do. Good scientific data, a very difficult enterprise to train yourself and figure out how to make that stuff work. So they have to be bad and they have to be good. Aesthetic experience. You guys seen Scruton's book, The Aesthetics of Architecture? Some of my colleagues still have it sitting on their shelf because someone made them read it. It's actually pretty good. But Roger Scruton, you can find him online and some YouTube stuff where he actually talks about aesthetics of architecture, because what he really means now is he just likes classicism. So from the Greeks, they liked classicism. The Romans, they liked classicism. The Renaissance, you guys heard of them? They like classicism. Stalin, Washington, D.C., they like classicism. So this is something that people seem to like, and they would call it good. So you have a neoclassical square based on a double square where we've placed a chrome egg at a point of focus because it seemed all good squares have some point of focus. So we put a chrome egg in there. 5 stories high because that's like the perfect urban scale. You go to Paris, major European cities, it's like, when they get more than 5 stories, it just doesn't seem very friendly anymore. Bad square. Colin's done some work on this. I don't know if this surprises you guys because you're like new in architecture. People don't like glass facades. They don't like them. They're hard, they're cold, and he has some data that shows that people walk faster past glass facades than they do stone facades. Be a good exercise for you. Stand out front, look at different facades, calculate with a stopwatch how fast people move in front of them, and please do send us the data. We'd be quite interested. So we have the flash cube square, and we have the classical square with the egg in it, and the egg is at the moment of the golden section. There's also some studies that show, I don't know how conclusive they are, but they show Greek figures, and they take these Greek figures and they mess with them. They stretch them out of proportion, and then they have people respond to these with biologicals on, and the people seem to be able to tell what the Greeks things are versus the non-Greek things. They seem to get it, okay? Classical glass. These are the 3 conditions: control, central vision, occluded, central vision only, right? Peripheral vision. Let's see. Behave, Michael. See, this will play. So this is how it has to work, right? So we have to flash this stuff at you because if we don't flash it at you, your eye can move, and we don't want your eye to move. So we're trying to keep your eye. So 200 milliseconds of flash, 50 milliseconds of blur, 750 milliseconds of, well, fixation. All right, so this is what it looks like. We put people in VR goggles, we get them wired up, and we get data that looks like this. This data tells, well, tells us, I say, but really it means Colin. It tells Colin, because he's a scientist. Up here we see central vision. These are the 2 central vision bars. So we took it, we went and sliced through the data of the galvanic skin stuff every 10 seconds and averaged it out to see what we could see. Right? So this is analysis of the data. Analysis of data is really tough stuff. I don't want to bore you with this. When I was in Chicago, I had to talk about science and I almost died. But here's peripheral vision down here, which seems to be doing some pretty good. Right? So that's the highest level. Galvanic skin is what we call lie detector. It takes micro sweat. and it reads arousal. So we don't know if you're happy aroused or sad aroused, right? Flight aroused or pleasure aroused. We don't know this, but we do know that there's an arousal factor. So the arousal factor in central is much higher than peripheral only. The other thing we did is we asked people, right, about when we had them walk through, they went into an arcade between the two places, and they had a video gaming platform where they could answer questions for us, right? So immediate. People will tell you good stuff immediately. If you wait very long, like any time at all, they start making up lies. But immediate answers are actually pretty good, scientifically speaking. Okay? So what we found is that legibility, this will surprise you, legibility of the space isn't very good if all you have is your central vision to look through, right? You guys predicted that, didn't you? If all I got is central vision, I'm not going to know where I'm at, so it's not going to be very legible. The emotional side is quite interesting too. So it seems from the emotional side that people like classical a little better. We expected that. But there's very little difference between peripheral vision and the control. That peripheral vision seems to be equal to, in a way, having your total vision. So this is a paper where this is a preliminary report that we sent to the Driehaus Foundation, who funded it. We're putting it together now for some serious peer review. But we think we can say this with some confidence, that there's a dramatic demonstration that the power of the visual periphery for the generation of architectural experience, this is meaningful, that we thought we would find that the periphery is important to architecture based on what we'd seen before. And it seems to be true by this small bit of data that we have. And no one else has data on this, so we're on this on our own. And this is pretty remarkable because if you think about vision science, or even your own kind of high school biology, vision is always central, right? So don't be trapped into this. This is what I'm trying to tell you. Don't be trapped into this thing as architecture students where someone tells you about vision and you don't come back to them and say, no, no, no. I know that peripheral vision is important. So all we asked of the participants was to observe and appraise the scene. And it seems that central vision wasn't all that important to them to make those appraisals. All right, so one more term I want to give you is affordance. And affordance comes from a guy named J.J. Gibson. And J.J. Gibson talks about the things in the world as we understand them through affordance, meaning their action potential to us. What can we do with them? What I'm going to argue is that architecture's meaning awaits in those affordances. Right? How does architecture mean to us? It means in what we can do with it. What can we do there? Let's go. Mark Johnson, if you read Mark Johnson's essay in that new book by Plasma and Sarah Robinson, he talks about a coffee cup. So the affordance of a coffee cup changes with its context, another very important notion for architects. Coffee cup on the shelf for purchase, coffee cup with your friends, coffee cup in the sink, coffee cup on your shelf. If this coffee cup was given to you by your favorite student or your wife, it would have a different meaning. So what we would argue is that affordances always have a double entendre, particularly in architecture. And this double entendre is, it has its cupness, its thingness. It is what it is. It's a coffee cup. But on top of that are the repertoire of experiences and things you bring with you. What have you brought to that cup? What are your memories? What do you need at the moment? I mean, it really changes if you want a cup of coffee or if you don't want a cup of coffee, right? So we made a similar experiment or show, right? We emptied Lindsay's dining room. An empty room has a certain affordance. You furnish it with a table and a chair, maybe a place where you can study. Furnish it more. Set it up for a romantic dinner, right? These are things you know, right? But I'm trying to make you now self-conscious as designers by using a term affordances, so you can begin to recognize that furnishing isn't simply furnishing, it's an invitation for action, and that the brain understands our relationship with many things, but in particular architecture, through its action potential. Professor Johnson says, architecture is, as experience, is sense-giving and signifying, right? Always a double entendre, right? Because we're not just animals who are utilitarian, but we're looking for signification and meaning in the world around us. Architecture is felt through qualities, meaning inhabit it, by way of particular affordances. Atmosphere is what architects make, right? And this lovely little book here, Tonino Graffiero, and Tonino was a very interesting philosopher for Rome. He's actually on a panel with, Vittorio and Kevin Rooney. What he suggests is that atmospheres are bridge qualities. Atmosphere is like an affordance. Right? It's not an affordance, it's like an affordance, because it's not a thing. Right? Affordances are primarily things. But what is atmosphere? And he says, well, let's talk about atmosphere, not because it's so ephemeral, but let's talk about it because it's so common, because no one speaks about atmosphere. I spoke about atmosphere in 2014, and I thought they were going to kill me at this place. A bunch of scientists, like atmosphere, like lightweight thinking. No, 14 pounds per square inch, right? Atmosphere is something, and he says, look, one of the things it is what you left when you walked out of the room. Right? It's there. When you come in here, right? Let's think about this room for just a second. If it's just one of us here, it's a different atmosphere than when all of us are here. So there's a codependency with atmosphere that architects understand, or should understand. Atmosphere is a quasi-thing. It's a relationship between the perceiver and the space. An atmosphere is like an affordance. It offers and invites us in, just like that romantic dinner. Just finish up here. This is one of my favorite rooms on the planet. Anybody been to Casa Vecchio in Verona? Scarpa's building? Yeah, you gotta go. I take students to Italy every 4 or 5 years, and I don't care what else we do, but we're gonna go there. Carlo Scarpa designed every aspect of this room, right? So there's the light quality and things, but look at how this painting is sitting here. And if we talk about standing at the doorway, which is what we're at, right? So we're really doing what she's doing in a different doorway. All of the kind of perspectival operations that are at stake seem to have a deep understanding of how the visual order of things is in operation, right? See the size of this, the size of that, right? Anybody know where that is? Well done, it's that. So here it is. We'll finish up. Our immediate engagement with space is pre-reflective and meaningful. Our experience of architecture is kinesthetic, meaning with the body, emotive, and hence perceived through enactments with one's own body. The duality of vision from the structure of the eye supports polar yet interlaced, right? We can't, whenever we deal with the brain, you can't split it in. We split things apart just like in design for analysis. None of this stuff is split apart. And the philosophical implications of mirror mechanisms through a series of affordances suggest how architecture means something. There we go, thanks.